In the brutal winter of 1625, while Spain struggled under outbreaks of typhus and the lingering aftershocks of plague, a disturbing rumour began circling the royal court of Madrid, one that combined political anxiety, religious superstition, and a queen whose personal habits became the centre of an international crisis. That queen was Elizabeth of France, the young wife of King Philip Roman IV of Spain. She was admired for her beauty, grace, and diplomacy. But behind palace walls, whispers grew. The queen never changed her undergarments. And in an age when disease swept through Europe like invisible fire, such neglect was not treated as a personal quirk. It was viewed as a threat capable of endangering the Spanish monarchy itself. This strange and shocking rumour was not born from mockery or gossip. It was rooted in a genuine medical fear. The early 17th century was a time when hygiene was poorly understood, and monarchs relied heavily on superstition, routine, and religious rituals. Doctors believed that illnesses travelled through bad vapours. It was believed that washing too often opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to infection. Many royals across Europe wore the same linen undergarments for days, weeks, or even months, convinced that changing or washing too often would invite death. But in the case of Spain's young queen, the situation was far more extreme. Elizabeth came from the French court of Marie de Medici, where hygiene was already far from modern standards. But when she married Philip Roman IV in 1615, joining the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, she entered a world even more rigid, conservative, and bound by strict courtly traditions. At the Spanish court, young queens were placed under the control of older, powerful ladies in waiting who enforced the rules of modesty with suffocating discipline. These older women believed that a queen should not expose her body to servants unnecessarily. As a result, Elizabeth was encouraged, sometimes forced, to avoid changing her linen undergarments for long periods. Historical records describe the Habsburg court as exceptionally severe about purification rituals. Bathing was seen as dangerous. Changing too often was viewed as immodest. To many, odor was simply part of life. But for Elizabeth, who was kept under close supervision and rarely allowed privacy, hygiene became nearly impossible. Some royal attendants later admitted that garments were sometimes worn until they were literally decaying. By 1625, just a decade into her marriage, the consequences of this neglect began to show. The queen frequently developed skin infections, rashes, and fevers, but the royal physicians blamed everything except hygiene. Some accused French perfumes of corrupting the blood. Others suggested the queen was under spiritual attack. A few whispered that the queen's illness might be divine punishment for political tensions between France and Spain. What made the situation dangerous for Spain was timing. The year 1625 was catastrophic for Europe. The 30 Years' War was raging. Spanish troops were fighting on multiple fronts. Trade routes were collapsing. In several cities, outbreaks of typhus and plague reappeared. Medical knowledge was primitive, but people understood one thing clearly: filth attracted lice, and lice carried disease. By then, Elizabeth's condition had become impossible to conceal. Her ladies in waiting were terrified. Servants reported that her bedding was rarely changed. Some were too afraid to go near her chambers. A few believed the queen was cursed. Others believed the French princess had brought illness intentionally, an absurd but powerful rumor in a time when France and Spain were enemies. The rumors traveled quickly through the palace, alarming not only servants but ministers of the crown. The Spanish monarchy depended on the queen for one essential duty: bearing heirs. A sick queen was not only a personal tragedy, it was a national threat. While Philip Roman IV was deeply devoted to Elizabeth, he was constantly away leading military campaigns, leaving the queen isolated with court officials who were more concerned with protocol than health. The king had little understanding of the environment she lived in. When he did return to court, he found a wife whose appearance had grown pale and tired, her vibrancy fading under the oppressive weight of palace routines. Doctors attempted to treat her worsening fevers with what they believed were purifying methods, herbs, incense, bleeding, and prayers. But nothing worked. As her condition lingered, more servants grew ill. Though there is no evidence that the Queen directly caused an outbreak, the fear of contagion spread faster than any confirmed disease. The Spanish court, already on edge from wars, famine, and rising political tensions, became an incubator for panic. Ministers blamed the Queen's attendants. Attendants blamed foreign customs. Priests warned that God punished courts where hygiene was neglected. Superstitions multiplied. Even foreign ambassadors wrote coded letters hinting that the Queen of Spain lived in conditions that offended the senses. It was a scandal the monarchy could not afford. Eventually, one of Philip Roman IV's most trusted advisers, the powerful Count, Duke of Olivers, insisted on reforming the Queen's household. His goal was simple: protect the Queen's health, preserve the monarchy's image, and prevent an outbreak that could devastate Madrid. But changing traditions at the Spanish royal court was like trying to push the ocean uphill. Every rule, every protocol, every ritual had been built over generations. Yet the danger was real enough that Olivers forced a confrontation. A team of court physicians and senior attendants were ordered to review the Queen's daily habits. What they found, according to accounts preserved in letters and archives, horrified them. Elizabeth's clothing routines were dangerously outdated even by 17th century standards. Her undergarments were sometimes worn until they caused skin sores. Linen meant to absorb sweat, and oils was left unchanged for weeks. Some garments were so degraded they had to be thrown away. Elizabeth herself was embarrassed and humiliated. She was young, just in her mid-20s, and deeply conscious of appearances, but she was also trapped by the rigid etiquette of the court. Queens were not independent, they were controlled. The more the physicians investigated, the more they realized that poor hygiene was not a personal failing. It was institutional, it was enforced by tradition, and ironically, those traditions were slowly destroying the very person they claimed to protect. Olivers used the findings to pressure the king for the sake of the kingdom. He argued the Queen must be allowed more privacy, more freedom, and better medical care. Philip Roman IV, frightened by rumors that his queen's condition could weaken the dynasty, agreed. New rules were introduced. Linen would be changed more often. The Queen's household staff was restructured. Physicians were given greater control than the older ladies in waiting. Gradually, Elizabeth's health improved, but the damage, politically and culturally, had already been done. The incident became a symbol of how tradition, superstition, and fear could combine to endanger not only a royal household, but an entire nation already weakened by war and disease. Modern historians often cite this episode as evidence of how deeply the 17th century struggled with basic hygiene, and how even the most powerful people in Europe lived in conditions that invited sickness. For Spain, the Queen's ordeal became a lesson about modernization. For Elizabeth, it became a quiet, humiliating chapter in a life already overshadowed by war, political turmoil, and personal tragedy. Yet the consequences of this scandal would not end here. What happened inside the Queen's chambers would soon ripple outward, changing how Spain viewed medicine, altering palace structures, and reshaping the daily rituals of European royalty. And in the decades that followed, historians would look back and ask, how close did Spain come to a preventable disaster simply because no one dared to break tradition? The reforms introduced by Olivers may have saved the Queen's health, but they ignited a silent and bitter conflict inside the Spanish royal household, a conflict between modern medical attempts and centuries-old traditions. What happened after the investigation of the Queen's hygiene sparked a power struggle that exposed just how fragile the Spanish monarchy truly was during the early 17th century. The older ladies in waiting of Elizabeth's household known as the Camaramaea, believed the new rules were an attack on their authority. For generations, these women controlled every movement, every garment, every breath of a queen's daily life. To be stripped of this control was not only humiliating, it was dangerous. Their influence shaped politics, marriages, and alliances. Losing power meant losing their place in the hierarchy of the palace. So, they resisted the new hygiene protocols at every step. They complained to cardinals, whispered to ambassadors, and hinted that Olivares was destroying Spain's traditions to weaken the monarchy. Some even accused the physicians of being agents of foreign powers. France was the traditional enemy. Italy was distrusted. German advisors were viewed with suspicion. The court became a battlefield of rumors. Meanwhile, Queen Elizabeth found herself torn between two worlds. She wanted better health, but she feared offending the tradition, bound women who had raised her within the Spanish court system. More importantly, she feared scandal. A queen's reputation was everything. If whispers about her hygiene reached foreign courts, it would become ammunition for political enemies. France could mock her. England could weaponize the rumors. The Dutch Republic, already fighting Spain, would use it to paint the monarchy as weak and decaying. Inside her private chambers, Elizabeth tried to adapt to the new rules slowly. Medicines were left on small wooden tables. Fresh linen was prepared discreetly. A new group of trusted servants was assigned to manage her clothing and bedding. But the resistance from the old guard was fierce. When Elizabeth attempted to follow the physician's instructions, arguments erupted in quiet corners of her quarters. Servants were caught between obeying the Queen and obeying the powerful Camaramaea who could destroy their careers. The Queen's health fluctuated during this period. Some weeks she seemed to improve, her skin clearing, her fever easing. Other weeks she sank back into exhaustion, overwhelmed by stress, the rigid schedule of the Spanish court, and the pressure placed on her to produce heirs for the monarchy. The tension reached a breaking point when one of Elizabeth's closest attendants fell gravely ill. The court panicked. Fear of contagion exploded. Servants ran through the palace whispering that death had entered the Queen's chambers. The physicians rushed in to examine the attendant and discovered she was suffering from a severe lice-related infection. It was the exact nightmare Olivares had warned of, an outbreak brewing in the heart of the palace. The incident gave Olivares the leverage he needed. He ordered a full reorganization of the Queen's household, a move unprecedented in Spanish court history. Several older attendants were quietly dismissed. Others were reassigned. The Camaramaea was stripped of some authority. Physicians gained more power than ever before. Court reforms were introduced that modernized hygiene standards not only in the Queen's chambers, but in the entire royal complex. These reforms, while still primitive by modern standards, were revolutionary for Spain. Bedding was changed more often. Clothing rituals were modified. Servants were given stricter cleaning duties. New supply routes were established to bring clean linen from across the kingdom. The palace, once bound by suffocating ritual, slowly moved toward a new era of health and organization. But political consequences followed. Noble families whose daughters had served in the Queen's household were angered. They saw the reforms as an insult to their honor. Many believed Olivares was manipulating the king by damaging the Queen's reputation. Foreign ambassadors sent letters across Europe describing the scandal in coded diplomatic language. France became suspicious that Spain was weakening from within. England viewed it as evidence of growing instability. Even the papal court in Rome heard whispers that the Queen of Spain had nearly sparked a health disaster. Elizabeth, trapped at the center of this storm, felt the emotional weight deeply. She began exercising more influence in court meetings, determined to regain her dignity. Letters she wrote during this period show a woman trying desperately to balance her duty with her desire to modernize the rigid world she lived in. She requested more freedom, more intellectual engagement, and more contact with educated members of the court, rather than merely ceremonial attendance. Surprisingly, her greatest support came from King Philip Roman IV. Though often away fighting in the 30 Years' War, Philip had an instinctive loyalty to Elizabeth. Their marriage, arranged for political reasons, slowly transformed into a relationship of trust. When he returned to Madrid and saw how court politics had suffocated his wife, he intervened. He supported Oliver's reforms. He allowed Elizabeth more private time away from the palace's suffocating protocols. He even insisted that she join him more often in councils, diplomatic receptions, and artistic gatherings. Philip's support improved Elizabeth's standing in the court, but it also deepened the hostility of those who saw the reforms as a threat to tradition. Still, the changes continued. Hygiene practices improved. The Queen's living conditions became far more humane, and crucially, her health stabilized. But the incident changed Elizabeth in ways deeper than the court realized. She became more involved in the education of her children, determined that the next generation of Spanish royalty would not be trapped by the mistakes of the past. She also took a strong interest in medicine, especially in new scientific ideas entering Europe through France and Italy. She secretly corresponded with foreign scholars. She requested books on anatomy, hygiene, and early medical theory, materials rarely read by women of her rank. While some courtiers mocked her curiosity, others admired it. Elizabeth began to gain a reputation as one of the more intelligent queens of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, overshadowing the humiliating rumors that once defined her early years in Spain. Yet even as the Queen regained strength, Spain itself was beginning to crumble under the weight of endless wars. The economy strained. Disease outbreaks still threatened major cities. Hunger spread in poorer regions. And in many ways the Queen's hygiene scandal became a symbol of the deeper rot within Spanish society, a nation trapped between old traditions and a rapidly changing world. Philip Roman IV relied more heavily on Elizabeth as tensions grew. She advised him on diplomatic matters, especially regarding France. She helped negotiate alliances. Her French birth, once a source of suspicion, now became an asset. Some historians believe she softened Spain's foreign policies during the harshest years of conflict. Her intelligence, compassion, and steady influence prevented political decisions that might have further weakened the monarchy. Still, the shadow of her earlier ordeal never fully disappeared. Rumors followed her across Europe. Though exaggerated and distorted, they served as reminders of the dangerous intersection between royal ritual and public health in the 17th century. The Queen's private reforms continued quietly for years. She created small routines that blended tradition with practicality, simple daily habits that greatly improved her health. These changes soon spread to other women of the court. Younger princesses, noblewomen, and even foreign visitors adopted the improved standards. Without intending to, Elizabeth helped modernize the hygiene culture of the Spanish aristocracy. Yet the greatest consequences of her story had not yet revealed themselves. For the challenges awaiting Spain, the death of heirs, the collapse of alliances, and the slow decline of the once mighty empire would require a queen whose resilience had been forged in this early crisis. By the time Europe realized what Elizabeth had survived, she had already transformed from a young, isolated queen into one of the most influential royal figures of her era. As the 1630s unfolded, Spain found itself staggering under pressure from every direction. The 30 Years' War drained the treasury, rebellions ignited across the empire, and outbreaks of disease continued to rise and fall unpredictably. In this atmosphere of instability, Queen Elizabeth's earlier hygiene scandal became more than an embarrassing moment in court history. It became a symbol of a kingdom struggling to decide whether it wanted to remain chained to the traditions of the past or embrace the cautious steps toward a more modern future. While Spain's armies marched across Europe, Elizabeth was quietly transforming her role inside the palace. The reforms she implemented after her health crisis did not stop at her bedside. She established new practices, enforced cleaner routines among her ladies in waiting, and insisted that servants maintain better standards of care in the royal nursery. These changes seemed minor, but in a court where every tradition was guarded like sacred scripture, they were revolutionary. Elizabeth also found herself increasingly involved in political matters. Philip Roman IV, heavily burdened by war, leaned on her diplomatic instincts. The Queen's natural intelligence and level head became essential to navigating the complex network of alliances and rivalries that defined 17th century Europe. She understood the French court, having grown up there. She understood the Spanish court, having survived it, and she knew the dangers of letting tradition override reason. Her personal struggle had hardened her. She recognized how quickly the smallest failure inside the court could spiral into the national crisis. When physicians warned of lice outbreaks in nearby cities, she instructed her staff to introduce more frequent linen changes in the royal chambers. When nobles protested, she ignored them. She knew what neglect could lead to. The memory of her illness, fevered nights, painful rashes, whispered rumors of contagion, never left her. As her confidence grew, so did her influence. Foreign ambassadors quickly realized that the Queen of Spain was more than a ceremonial figure. She possessed a sharp diplomatic mind and an understanding of European politics that rivaled many male ministers of her time. French diplomats wrote cautiously flattering reports about her behavior. The papal court in Rome noted that she was compassionate but firm, pious but not naive. Even the Dutch, locked in bitter conflict with Spain, acknowledged the Queen's presence in state affairs. But power always invites resistance. Inside the palace, some conservative nobles and clergy began to resent Elizabeth's growing authority. They blamed her French background for changes in court etiquette. They accused her of undermining Spanish traditions by supporting medical reforms and modern ideas. Some even whispered that the Queen encouraged the king to weaken the influence of the old Spanish nobility. One of the Queen's greatest opponents was the same class of older female courtiers who had once dictated her daily life. The Camera Mayor and her allies believed Elizabeth's new independence was dangerous. They argued that a queen's primary duty was obedience, not leadership. Their resentment steepened when the Queen began choosing her own attendants instead of accepting those offered by powerful noble families. This tension came to a head in 1634. That year, Madrid faced a severe outbreak of typhus and other diseases. Hospitals overflowed, markets emptied, fear spreads through the streets like smoke. The palace responded by tightening security and restricting movement inside royal chambers. Some ministers wanted to shut the Queen off from public life entirely, locking her behind the ceremony until the outbreak passed. But Elizabeth refused. She argued fiercely in council that fear would only weaken the kingdom. Instead of retreating behind closed doors, she organized charitable efforts, arranged supplies for the sick, and insisted on keeping communication alive between the crown and the people. Her presence reassured terrified citizens who believed their rulers had abandoned them. Her involvement helped stabilize morale during one of the most difficult moments of the 1630s. Still, the outbreak was a reminder of how fragile hygiene systems were, and once again, the Queen's earlier scandal was dragged public through whispered commentary. Some courtiers muttered that Spain had been punished because the Queen's early habits had offended divine order. Others claimed the reforms she supported were unholy foreign ideas. The debates inside the palace grew so intense that Philip Roman IV was forced to intervene. He declared publicly that the Queen's health measures were not only acceptable, but necessary for the welfare of the kingdom. It was a significant moment. For one of the most powerful kings in Europe to defend hygiene reforms was unusual. But Philip had seen the consequences of neglect himself. He had nearly lost his queen. He refused to risk disaster again. This declaration strengthened Elizabeth's position. her supporters grew more confident. Ministers who valued science and physicians who advocated cleaner practices felt safer pushing for change. Slowly, new routines began spreading from the palace to other noble households. Cleanliness became linked with discipline, productivity, and religious responsibility. While Spain did not experience a medical revolution overnight, the Queen had planted a seed that would slowly influence future generations. But the Queen's influence did not make her life easier. The weight of duty pressed harder each year. Between 1629 and 1644, Elizabeth experienced multiple pregnancies, including miscarriages and difficult births. The pressure to produce healthy heirs for the Habsburg dynasty was immense. Doctors of the era offered little help, relying more on superstition than medical knowledge. Though she gave birth to several children, only 2 survived infancy, Maria Theresa and Balthasar Charles. The death of her other children broke her spirit repeatedly. Her earlier struggles with hygiene, illness, and court politics had prepared her for suffering, but nothing prepared her for the loss of her babies. Letters written during these years reveal a queen drowning in grief, yet refusing to withdraw from her responsibilities. She advised the king, mediated between feuding nobles, and continued pushing for improvements in palace life. One of Elizabeth's greatest contributions during this time was her role as a cultural patron. She encouraged the works of artists, musicians, and writers, helping shape one of the most creative periods in Spanish history. The painter Diego Velázquez, who would become one of the greatest artists of all time, painted her multiple times. His portraits reveal a queen whose eyes carried both resilience and sadness. Yet even as Elizabeth matured into a powerful figure, Spain's crisis deepened. Defeats on the battlefield drained morale. Rebellions erupted in Portugal and Catalonia. The economy suffered. The plague lurked like a shadow, striking unpredictably. Through all this, Elizabeth became the quiet stabilizing force at court. She was not a ruler, but Philip Roman IV increasingly relied on her as if she were. Her influence softened his harsher impulses. Her moral grounding pushed him toward compromise when weariness threatened to tear the kingdom apart. When the king fell into despair, Elizabeth reminded him that resilience, not fear, kept Spain standing. Behind the scenes, her earlier ordeal had taught her a crucial lesson. Negligence invites collapse. Hygiene was only the first battleground. The Queen now applied that principle to politics, diplomacy, and governance. She refused to let Spain decay in silence the way her own health had nearly decayed years before. Her strength would be tested more severely than ever in the coming years, for the greatest tragedy of Elizabeth's life, one that would shake the entire kingdom, was approaching. And it was not a disease. It was the death of the child who represented the future of the Spanish crown. Everything she had built, everything she had protected, everything she had survived would soon collide with this devastating event. The early 1640s marked the height of Queen Elizabeth's influence and, at the same time, the beginning of her deepest heartbreak. Spain was fighting for survival on every front. Portugal had risen in open rebellion. Catalonia erupted in revolt. And Spanish armies, already exhausted from years of war in Flanders and Germany, were stretched to their limits. Inside the palace, tension grew daily, and the survival of the monarchy seemed to rest on the shoulders of the young crown prince, Balthasar Charles, the only surviving male heir of Philip Roman IV and Elizabeth. Born in 1629, Balthasar Charles carried the hopes of an empire. From the moment he could stand, the court molded him into a symbol of continuity. Ministers, generals, bishops, and nobles poured their expectations onto the prince. To many, he was the child destined to restore Spain's declining glory. And to Elizabeth, he was more than an heir. He was the living proof that all her struggles, sacrifices, and humiliations had not been in vain. Elizabeth guarded him fiercely. Her earlier hygiene ordeal left her with a deep fear of sickness, and she applied her hard, won reforms to the royal nursery with strict discipline. Clean linen, fresh herbs, controlled routines, and safer sleeping conditions became the foundation of the prince's upbringing. Her opponents mocked her caution, calling it French delicacy, but Elizabeth ignored them. She had seen what neglect could do. She refused to let her son live in the dangerous environment that had once threatened her own health. The prince thrived. By the age of 10, he was bright, athletic, and admired across the kingdom. Painters such as Velázquez immortalized him in portraits that radiated youth, dignity, and promise. Balthasar Charles was known for his intelligence, his love of riding, and his natural charm. Even the strict ministers of the Spanish court admitted privately that the boy possessed the rare combination of confidence and kindness necessary to lead a troubled empire. But as the prince grew, the pressures on him intensified. He accompanied his father to councils, learned statecraft, and travelled across Castile to gain the loyalty of the people. The Spanish court, exhausted by war and disease, looked to him as their future hope. Yet hope in 17th century Europe was always fragile. In 1644, during a royal journey through the region of Aragon, Balthasar Charles suddenly fell ill. Fever struck without warning. Court physicians rushed to diagnose him, but their knowledge was limited. Some believed he had contracted a dangerous infection from spoiled food. Others suspected typhus or a viral fever circulating in the region. The Queen, upon hearing the news, abandoned protocol and travelled urgently to her son's bedside. When Elizabeth arrived, she found her child pale, sweating, and struggling to breathe. The physicians attempted their usual remedies: bleeding, purging, herbal mixtures, and prayers. None worked. The Queen, horrified, fought to intervene, but medical customs forbade women, and especially queens, from interfering in treatment. Her earlier reforms had improved hygiene, but they had not yet dethroned the medieval medical practices that dominated Spain. As the fever worsened, Balthasar Charles drifted between consciousness and delirium. He called for his mother. He asked for his horse. He whispered promises that he would make Spain proud. Courtiers wept outside his chamber. Ministers panicked. Philip Roman IV rode through the night to reach his son's side, but by the time he arrived, the prince's condition had deteriorated beyond saving. In the evening hours of October 9, 1644, the heir to the Spanish throne took his final breath. The moment the news spread, the entire palace collapsed into grief. Servants screamed, ministers fell to their knees. Some believed the death of the prince was a sign that God was punishing Spain for its sins. Others whispered that the dynasty was now cursed. The kingdom had lost its future in an instant, but no one suffered as deeply as Elizabeth. She remained by her son's body long after others had left the room. Witnesses described her sitting motionless, her hands resting on the prince's shoulder as if refusing to accept the truth. For years she had fought court politics, illness, and the suffocating traditions of the palace to protect her child. She had survived humiliation, sickness, and the hostility of nobles. Yet when her son needed her most, she had been powerless. Her heartbreak was devastating. She refused food. She barely slept. The once vibrant queen who had brought stability to Spain was consumed by grief. Chroniclers wrote that her sorrow was so deep it seemed to hollow her from within. Even the king, overwhelmed by his own devastation, could not console her. The prince's death shook the political world as well. Without a male heir, Spain faced an uncertain future. Philip Roman IV had no surviving sons, and the dynasty's continuation seemed endangered. Enemies of Spain celebrated quietly, seeing opportunity in its misfortune. Allies mourned, fearing instability. The empire, already weakened by war and rebellion, now faced the terrifying possibility of a succession crisis. In the months that followed, the queen's health declined rapidly. The grief she carried dug into her body, like a slow burning sickness. Physicians blamed melancholy. a condition poorly understood but commonly diagnosed in the early modern period. No treatment eased her suffering. Her vitality faded, and by the end of 1644 she appeared dramatically aged. Her chambers, once symbols of reform and strength, became quiet, shadowed rooms where she spent her final days praying and mourning. Even the courtiers who had once opposed her reforms now felt pity. They could not deny that Elizabeth had been one of the most dedicated, intelligent, and compassionate queens in Spanish history. On October 6, 1644, just 3 days before the anniversary of her son's death, Elizabeth herself passed away. She was only 39 years old. Her death struck the kingdom like a second blow. Spain had lost its queen, a stabilizing force during some of its darkest years. Philip Roman IV broke down completely, locking himself away for days in private mourning. Foreign ambassadors reported that the king's grief was unmatched. Spain's enemies saw an opportunity, and its allies feared the grief of the king might plunge the empire into further instability. Yet even in death, the legacy of Elizabeth reshaped the kingdom. Her reforms survived. The hygiene protocols introduced during her early crisis became permanent features of palace life. Future queens benefited from the freedom and cleanliness she fought for. The royal nursery continued her practices, saving countless children from preventable illness. Over time, the Spanish court adopted more modern medical ideas, inspired in part by the Queen's insistence on change. Her daughter, Maria Theresa, would go on to become Queen of France and play a key role in European politics. Her influence helped maintain peace between France and Spain, fulfilling the diplomatic vision her mother had always hoped for. Even historians who doubted old court rumors acknowledged that Elizabeth's intelligence and resilience had shaped the monarchy in ways that few queens had ever achieved. The scandal of her early years, the rumor that she never changed her undergarments, remained a footnote in history, overshadowed by her real achievements. Modern scholars understand that the issue was not personal laziness, but the oppressive protocols of the Spanish court. Elizabeth's ordeal is now seen as a case study in how superstition and tradition can endanger both individuals and empires. Her story reveals a powerful truth about the 17th century. The survival of a kingdom often depended not just on military strength or political alliances, but on the personal lives of the individuals trapped inside royal walls. A queen's health could influence national stability. A child's illness could shape the future of an empire. A single outdated tradition could risk the spread of disease. The queen who never changed her underwear did not bring plague to Spain. But she lived in a system that could have, and almost did. Her fight to modernize the very routines that once endangered her life became one of her greatest contributions to history. Elizabeth of France entered Spain as a symbol of alliance. She left as a symbol of courage, reform, and transformation. Her life, marked by tragedy and triumph, shows how even in the darkest courts of Europe, change could begin with a single voice refusing to remain silent.